Like Keegan said, my name is Jamie. I use she, hers pronouns, and I'm the lead organizer with Futurewise's Washington Can't Wait campaign. And I'm just going to go ahead and share. Oh, can you give me permission to share my screen, Keegan?
You should now have.
Perfect. Okay. Can y'all see my slides?
Yes, I can.
All right, excellent. Yep, so this year Futurewise is running our Washington Can't Wait campaign. And so I'm just gonna go over for you a little bit of background on Futurewise and the work we do with the Growth Management Act, what our Washington Can't Wait campaign is about, and then at the end, some ways for y'all to get involved if you're interested. So if you're not familiar with Futurewise, we are a Seattle-based organization, but we operate statewide, and we are more or less an accountability organization for Washington's Growth Management Act. And the Growth Management Act is this pretty wonky body of statewide legislation that was started in the 1990s. And it is essentially a tool that requires counties and cities, our fastest growing counties and cities in Washington, to make plans to manage their population growth. So every 8 years, they have to do a thorough review, update their comprehensive plan for growth, and those plans have to address these 14 goal areas that you see on the left side of the screen. So it's everything from urban growth to critical habitat protection to historic preservation. And really the overarching goal of the Growth Management Act was it was created to manage Washington's population growth in a way that protects our forests, our farmlands, our natural resources, and also limits urban sprawl and make sure that the growth that's happening in our urban centers is happening in a way where folks have access to transportation and capital facilities, and really easy access to work and school and parks and recreation areas. And so those are kind of the overarching goals of the Growth Management Act. And after this presentation, I can drop a link to Futurewise's Beginner's Guide to the GMA, because it is, it can be a little confusing, but this is essentially how it functions. Futurewise works to hold cities and counties accountable. So as they're going through their comp plan update process, if we think that they're trying to do things that are not in alignment with what the Growth Management Act says they need to be doing, we'll bring in an appeal. We work with individual groups across the state. Just try to bring some accountability into our state's growth management. And even though the Growth Management Act is great and there's a lot of things that it's done to preserve habitat and manage sprawl, there are 3 pretty big and gaping holes in it that Futurewise has identified. And we really believe that if we're able to rewrite it and add some new policy into the Growth Management Act, it can be a tool to leverage to address some of the biggest crises currently facing Washington. And so the first of these is that currently, even though there is an affordable housing element in the Growth Management Act, it lacks specificity, which makes it really hard for us to hold cities and counties accountable, because it doesn't actually say what kind of housing they need to be providing for their communities, nor does it say or really define what affordable is. The second really, really big gaping hole in the Growth Management Act is that it doesn't address climate change at all, which is pretty notable given the really clear connections between our land use and the way that we plan our neighborhoods and our transportation systems and climate change. And then the last piece of this is that it currently doesn't address issues of social and racial equity in land use development. So no talk of environmental justice, equity, no recognition of the ways in which our land use and housing policies in the past have been racially biased and discriminatory, and so offers no ways to really hold cities and counties accountable to addressing those issues in our land use policy. And so those are the 3 holes that we are working to fill with our Washington Can't Wait campaign. And so our overall goals are in this 2021 legislative session to pass the most comprehensive update to the Growth Management Act in the past 30 years. It really hasn't been substantively updated since it was written. The update will incorporate policy to address climate change, affordable housing, and environmental justice. And we're working to accomplish these goals both by pressuring key legislators through effective lobbying, working with our lobbyists, And then also by building a volunteer-led grassroots campaign and getting really broad support, not only from constituents, but from organizations across the state who are ready to go to bat for these policies during session this year. And we currently have over 50 organizations that have signed on who we're working with on this campaign. So yeah, so I think that's just important to note. This isn't just a Futurewise initiative. It's also not just an environmental initiative. It's something we've been working on in collaboration with folks at the Climate Alliance, as well as the Environmental Priorities Coalition and many others across the state. And there's a reason that we called our campaign Washington Can't Wait. And that is, we really think this is our last chance to pass legislation to fill these gaps. Some of our largest and fastest growing counties in the central Puget Sound area have their next comprehensive plan updates due in 2024. And so they will start undergoing that review process this year to update those plans. So if we don't get this legislation passed and incorporated, it's likely that we'll miss that next round of updates. 2024 will come around, their comprehensive plans will get locked into place, and it'll be another decade until some of our largest and fastest growing counties are addressing these issues through their land use policy. And yeah, I think it's you don't need to look far past the summer to know that climate change has arrived in Washington. To doesn't matter where you live in Washington, affordable housing is an issue, and I think we're really past time to deal with these issues, and waiting another decade just isn't an option. So I'll just give a really kind of high level overview. So like I said, we have 3 different legislative priorities. We're looking to address these 3 issues with 3 separate bills this session. So the first, add a new climate goal to the Growth Management Act. So if you think back to that Growth Management Act slide that I had with the 14 goals listed on the left-hand side, this would add climate change as one of the goals that cities and counties have to plan for. And that goal would have 2 parts. One would require cities and counties to plan to protect environmental, economic, and human health and safety from the impacts of climate change by planning for resiliency and mitigation from climate change, and also planning for increased occurrences of natural hazards, things like sea level rise, wildfires, droughts, landslides, all of these hazards that are likely to increase in frequency as climate change worsens in the coming years. The second part of this climate change goal will require the 10 largest and fastest growing counties that you can see listed on the bottom of the screen to make plans to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and their vehicle miles traveled to help achieve statewide targets for reduction. So right now, the state of Washington has goals for reducing both of these things, but cities and counties aren't actually required to do anything in their planning processes to help meet those goals. So the hope here is what this will result in is planning for communities that are a little bit, denser, where folks have really easy access to robust public transportation, communities that are walkable and bike, where folks don't need to get in a car and drive to get to work or the grocery store or the park. So really trying to plan communities that are more thoughtful and that really limit our reliance on single occupancy vehicles. So those are the overarching sort of policy points of the climate change goal. This is being sponsored in the House by Davina Dewar and Joe Fitzgibbon. The bill dropped last week. The number for the bill is 9. And if you go to the Washington State Legislature website, there's a place where you can look up the different bills that have dropped for this session, and you can get emails to stay up to date as these bills move in to committee hearings and come up for votes. And the hearing for this bill is scheduled for next Tuesday at 8 a.m. with the Environment and Energy Committee, and there will be opportunities to submit written testimony on behalf of the bill if that's something that you're interested in doing. The second is we are working to update the housing element of the Growth Management Act. This update would include changes that would require jurisdictions to update their comprehensive plan housings to plan for a diversity of housing types that are available for families at all income levels. So not just single family homes, not just high-rise apartments, but more duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, that sort of missing middle of housing. and really focus on making sure that there's and low-income families. This includes planning for subsidized housing, supportive housing, and transitional housing. And the other part of this legislation is really focused on this issue of equity, and it will require jurisdictions to actually identify and give a timeline to address policies and regulations that have resulted in racial bias and exclusion in housing. So things like redlining and racial covenants, looking at the historic impacts those have had, primarily on our low income and BIPOC communities of color, and making plans to address those disparities. It will also incorporate anti-displacement practices and policies in our land use changes, especially in communities that are at a high risk of displacement from market forces. So folks who are at risk of getting priced out of their neighborhoods as housing and rent continue to rise. This update is going to be sponsored by Strom Peterson. We are still waiting to get a number from the code reviser, but expect to have a number by the end of the week. And then hopefully soon thereafter, a better idea of what sort of the arc of the bill will look like in terms of when it will be moving into committee, when it will come up for a vote, to make it easier to engage and get involved in advocating for this piece of legislation. And then finally, our last initiative is to make sure that we are addressing environmental justice across the entire Growth Management Act. Front and Centered, which is a national justice and equity organization that has a chapter in Washington, is taking the lead in drafting this legislation, working from the Environmental Justice Task Force recommendation, and we are supporting them in that work and advocating for it as sort of the third pillar of our Washington Can't Wait campaign. This bill would require issues of environmental justice to be considered across, as I said. It would require jurisdictions to identify and track populations that are overburdened by pollution, that face a high risk of displacement, have low mobility options, have low climate resiliency, and make plans to address those disparities. And it would also require jurisdictions to advance more equitable participation, outreach, and information sharing in their planning processes, and resource allocation, and program development and enforcement, so that those folks and communities that are being most impacted by environmental change and environmental hazards are really centered in our planning processes. So that's the arc of this bill. We are in conversation with a few potential sponsors and have yet to announce who will be sponsoring the bill. And we're still waiting again to get the number back from the code reviser. Hopefully by the end of this week, we'll have all of that information to share out with all of our supporters. And these here are the potential House committees for our Growth Management Act legislation. So we know our climate bill on Tuesday is going to be heard by the Environment and Energy Committee on the left here. Our other two Growth Management Act bills will go to either local government or Housing and Human Services. The reason that this is important is because these representatives that you see listed as seated on these committees are going to be really, really important people to get on our side. And it's going to be really important that we have their support if we want this legislation to pass. So these are the legislative districts that as a campaign, we're targeting a lot of our effort and energy towards getting constituents in these districts really engaged in reaching out to their legislators. Yeah, and then just for a little context on the legislative session, it's going to be unprecedented. This is the first ever totally virtual legislative session the state has gone through. It is what we call a long session, so it'll run 105 days from January 11th to April 25th. So it just started this Monday. The budget is going to be a really big consideration this year because it's the only thing that our legislators are actually required to do in these long sessions. That being said, the Washington Democrats released their top priorities for this session, and those are COVID relief, racial justice, budget, and climate, which is good news for us because we think our legislation really clearly fits underneath this arc. And then, like I said, this is the first ever virtual session, which means we're still trying to figure a lot of things out. I think both, organizations and individuals who are advocating, as well as our legislators, are trying to get an idea of what it's really going to look like to do everything virtually, what testimony will look like, what participation will look like. The good news is that, if you have Wi-Fi, and access to a screen, it's easier than ever for you to testify, to give your input, to meet with your legislators, because you don't have to drive to Olympia to do that. But it also means that there is going to be fewer bills proposed and passed this year. About 1/3 of what we usually see in a long session will be passed this legislative session, which just means that we need to be organizing even harder if we want our legislators to hold these Growth Management Act updates as a top priority. Whew. So big picture, the 2021 legislative session is here, and it is going to be wonky and weird. Getting these GMA updates passed will be an uphill battle. But like I said, it's really imperative that it does happen this year. Washington cannot wait any longer to address these issues. And our legislators will prioritize these updates if they get really enthusiastic support from constituents across the state. And with that, there are a couple ways that you all can get involved if you're interested. As an individual, you can just sign up for our email list and you'll get weekly updates on the state of legislation and ways that you can engage. If you want to level up, you can not only respond to those yourself, but also share them in your networks with your friends and your family, ask other people to take part in this really important democratic process. Every week on Friday and Saturday, we run phone banks where we call constituents in those key districts, people whose legislators are sitting on the committees that are going to be hearing our legislation, and ask them to get involved, to reach out, to make their voice heard. Also always looking for more folks to help us phone bank every week. If you are a writer or want to try your hand at writing, we're also running an op-ed campaign. We've had about 10 published op-eds by our volunteer writers across the state, just talking about, why issues of climate change and housing affordability and environmental justice matter to you, why these things, why it's important to address these things in your community, and really just helping to draw attention to the campaign through local media outlets. And the final, maybe most influential way you can have an impact this legislative session is to work either as an individual or in a group to have a virtual lobbying meeting with your legislators. Futurewise has a lobbying guide that has step-by-step instructions on how to set up a meeting, has messaging guides for our legislation, and makes it really, really easy to advocate with your legislators. So I'll also drop a link to that guide in the chat if that is something that you're interested in doing, and we'd be really happy to support you. And then that brings me to what the Rainier Beach, the Rainier Beach community, I get the order of the C's mixed up.
Community club.
Community club, okay. One thing that you all can do is join this group of organizations across the state that have signed on to endorse the Washington Can't Wait campaign. We can add your name, your logo to our sign-on letter, and then you as a group will get weekly updates with calls to action that you can share out to your supporters and members to get even more folks involved. So that is another way to participate and really support this work, this legislative session. And with that, I will shut up. I know that was a lot of information all at once. And so if we have time, we'll take any questions that you might have.
Alan, you're raising your hand.
I had two questions. One,
Sure.
One was like the number of the bill that actually has a number, because I went to the website for the legislature and it's really hard to navigate.
Yeah, so the bill number is it's 1099.
I found it. Yep. Okay.
And so at that site, you'll be able to, like I said, sign. I just dropped a bunch of links in the chat also. Sorry for blowing it up. But yeah, so you can sign up for email notifications. Also, the full bill language is available if you look it up on the Washington State site, so you can just read the bill yourself and see kind of all the details that are within it.
Secondly, I'm not really familiar with legislature, how it works. We is this considered like a bipartisan type of thing, or how are bills introduced?
Yeah, so the bills are introduced, often interest groups or different advocacy groups like Washington Environmental Council or Futurewise we'll work with our lobbyists to and with different legislators to write legislation based on our priorities. Then you get somebody in the legislature to sponsor it. So we've been working with Davina Dore. When the session rolls around, the bill gets sent to the code reviser. It gets all legalized. All the language gets ironed out, and then the sponsor drops it. So it becomes an official bill. Either bills can get dropped in the House or the Senate, and then typically they get assigned to a committee. They go to that committee, the committees discuss them, take votes on them, send them to, if they decide to, send them then to appropriations, which determines sort of like budget and funding. And then it'll get sent to the other house to get voted on again.
Great. Well, yeah, it's important because as a club, we're unable to be partisan. So I just wanted to see how that fit in with how bills are done. So thank you.
I think too, if it's a subject matter versus a candidate,
Right.
there's a big difference too, Alan. I've got a question for you, Jamie, because so much of this seems so mild, frankly. What groups do you think in Washington State are going to oppose any of these?
Yeah, so I think opposition like generally comes from builders, realtors, sometimes from cities and counties that don't want to do more work with their comprehensive plans. Those are probably the three biggest, like groups of folks who generally oppose this work and don't want more regulation. And then I think also just in more conservative parts of the state where folks just don't want as much government regulation, like generally, and our more conservative legislators who don't even, some of them don't even think the Growth Management Act should exist. So those, I think, politically, yeah, are kind of our main opposition. But in general, I think there's very broad support for this legislation. The issue is just because it's such a condensed session. While a lot of legislators might agree that these are important issues and that they need to be dealt with, we really need to convince them that they need to prioritize these in particular this year and that they can't wait until next year, because they are going to be very, very particular about what they put their time and energy behind, given how few bills are going to be passed.
Thank you.
So if our legislator, Kristen Talley, Harris Talley, is on, I think it was the Committee for Affordable Housing and Energy. Was that it?
Yeah, she's actually on the Environment and Energy Committee.
Environment, okay. If she's on that committee, can we assume that she's pretty much in support of this and we don't need to be leveraging her? Or what kind of direction would we, as individuals or as a group, give her?
Yeah, so I think Kristen Harris Talley has come out and said, tweeted and expressed that she is supportive of this campaign, and so we're feeling pretty good that she'll support, be supportive of this legislation as it moves into that committee. That being said, I'll believe her when, and I hope that's true, and I'll believe her when she votes on it. And until then, like as much enthusiastic support as she can continue to get from all of you, saying like, hi, like, hey, like we're so excited about this campaign. We're really excited for you to champion this legislation. I think she's very likely to support it, but I always err on the side of caution and assume people won't support it, until they really, have that critical mass of people like making it so they can't ignore it, and they really do need to, be on the side of support. So I would say, like as a group, as individuals, over these days, sending Kristen Harris Talley emails, making phone calls, in that volunteer advocacy toolkit that I put a link to it in the chat. You can find our legislator contact guide, and that has ways to call and email your legislators. In the next day or so, I'll be sending out ways to submit written testimony to all of our supporters. So sort of, you can either sign up to give spoken testimony during the hearing, or you can submit written testimony up to an hour after the hearing next Tuesday. So until 9 a.m., you'll be able to submit written testimony expressing why you support the bill. So we'll have directions on how to do that as well, coming out in the next few days.
Thank you.
I've got then one other question too. So after the state puts down, these are the criteria, then does it come back to the county to refine what they intend to do?
Yeah, so once the policy gets incorporated into the Growth Management Act, then it will apply. So no city or county will have to like go back and revise, if they're not yet revising their comprehensive plan, they won't have to incorporate these updates until their next like update date. So this would first apply to all of those counties that have an update due in 2024. And then I think the next round is in 2026 for a couple of counties. So yeah, it'll get incorporated into the Growth Management Act, and counties and cities will have to abide by those new policies the next time that they are updating their comprehensive plans.
So with King County, assuming it's in 24, if we wanted to be active in the changes to that, we would have to be active pretty soon.
Yes, that would be correct. And then I think the other key thing with the Growth Management Act is it does, like, there's nobody in the government that's necessarily holding cities and counties accountable. And so it really relies on public participation in the planning process. So even, if these updates get passed, then you can continue to play a role by sort of keeping tabs on King County as they go through the comprehensive planning process. And there should be opportunities for you to be involved and give feedback and express what you want to see in those plans.
Jamie, I have a question. I'm just thinking about other areas. It seems like there would be a lot of support in our area in King County. I'm just thinking of people that I might know in other counties. I assume you're reaching out to other areas where it would be really great to get additional support that might not hear that from their legislators. If we know people in other places, have you reached out to other areas, or do you have advocates in other areas that we can kind of connect our friends up to?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. We've been doing a lot of work up in sort of the Whatcom-Skagit area to get more supporters in the 40th legislative district, over in the Spokane area and the 3rd legislative district, the Seattle area, and then sort of all of our east side neighborhoods. We've been working on getting advocates, and then we have folks. I mean, just thinking about our organizational partners, we have partners in Olympia, in Tacoma, in Vancouver, and Wenatchee, really kind of all over the maps. So yeah, the sky's the limit. If there's anybody anywhere in the state who might be interested in getting involved, like I would love to be connected with them and see how we can work together.
And then one other question: have you reached out to the American Institute of Architects? They're quite involved in policy generation. I don't know if they've been supportive of this.
Yeah, they were actually, I think, like the 3rd group to sign on to our platform. And yeah, we've been working really closely with them, and they're right now planning advocacy days for their members to go meet about this legislation, which we're super grateful for.
I mean, I had a question about the resources that you posted into the chat. Some of those I see are Google Docs. I'm wondering if that list exists somewhere on the Futurewise website, or I'm just trying to see if we should copy these notes somewhere that people can find them, or if it's available elsewhere.
Yeah, you should be. I think all of these are available on our website. If you go to the Washington tab on our page, the volunteer advocacy toolkit, like within itself, has links to pretty much all these other links are included in that toolkit. I'm also just happy, Keegan, to send you an email with all these links if that would be convenient, and you can share it out with folks that way.
Sure, that would be great.
Cool.
I have a question. I'm wondering, is this the first year that your organization has tried adding these new goals?
Yes, yes.
Second attempt, first time.
So this is we tried to do some version of the climate bill last year, and it did not pass. I only just started at Futurewise organizing this campaign in September, so I don't know in detail the reasons that didn't go through. I do know that we are feeling much better about our chances of passing it this year than last year. But in terms of the housing and the environmental justice aspects, this is our first time. Our first time pushing for this.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Cool. Well, if anybody has any other questions, let me know. I will also just put my email in the chat. Any of you, welcome to reach out to me if you have any more questions. If you have any like other people around the state that you want to be connected and looped into this campaign, feel free to CC me or send me their contact info. Also always happy to yeah, connect with anybody one-on-one if you want to talk about more about the campaign and ways to get involved.
Thank you so much, Janie. Any last questions? Just
Oh,
applause.
stop. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation again. And I would love an email with a list of those resources just so we can make sure that they're available to everybody.
Yeah, sure. I will shoot that off to you right now.
Great. I'm going to stop recording.